So thank you very much for that introduction before. I am Lindsay Holmwood. Today I'm going to be talking about API security, particularly over the next sort of 5 to 10 years. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are meeting on here today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. So, as mentioned, I'm Lindsay. I come from CipherStash. So CipherStash, we're building products, encryption products to help you protect sensitive data and enable safe access for that information across your organisation. I'm in a product role, but I come from an infrastructure and software engineering background. So a big part of my job is to sort of look at the bigger picture that our customers are operating in, and trying to understand the landscape. Things that are happening in the past, things that are happening now, and trying to extrapolate from that to things that are possibly going to happen in the future. And if you're interested in any of the content or the slides that I talk about here today, you can find a copy of those after the talk. This talk here is done at CipherStash.com/Lindsay. So part of being aware of what's happening in the world more generally is that I'm just basically saturated and living in bad news pretty much all the time. So there's a lot of bad news at the moment, particularly in the cybersecurity world. So IBM, they released their cost of data breach report in 2022. Just about a month or so ago, and they said that the global average total cost of a data breach is now about $4.35 million US dollars. And it's worth noting that's the global average. So in the US in particular, it's actually bumping up close to 10 million itself for each individual data breach. It's just getting more expensive year on year. And the data breach costs are actually increasing about 2 to 3% year on year at the moment. Occasionally there are big jumps, but it's only going up. It's only going to continue to be a problem for people like us who are responsible for building the APIs. And the landscape more generally is changing. So particularly, we're all familiar with GDPR, maybe to a lesser extent CCPA. And regulators are coming on board. They're going, okay, this is really serious. There's lots of data here that we need to try and protect. Obviously, the industry isn't going to regulate itself. And so we're going to introduce regulations that are going to make it important to actually protect the privacy of the users who are disclosing their data. And the thing that I'm quite looking forward to is what's going to happen in the US probably in the next year or so. There's this legislation that got put up about a month or so ago called the APIscene, and it's basically the US equivalent of the GDPR. It got put up, it actually got voted down because it wasn't strong enough in the sort of privacy protections that are being angled for. So, it's only going to get more problematic for people who are building APIs and tools in the future. Ransomware as well in 2021 cost $20 billion globally and nearly $7 billion in the United States alone. So from the FBI's IC3 crime report that they put out at the end of last year, you can see here that the total loss is 18.7 billion, or, roughly somewhere between. There are different figures, but somewhere between 18 and 20 billion, and complaints are just going up and up as well. The thing that we're finding is that the attackers as well, just with the number of breaches that are happening, they're increasing their sophistication of their techniques and the tempo at which they are operating at. So in May in India, the e-hospital system, which is used for tracking patient notes and discharge summaries and medical details, there are about 250 million patients who were exposed, had their records exposed on a public Elasticsearch instance. The Costa Rican government, didn't really see much about this in the mainstream news, but the Costa Rican government basically went offline for several weeks. That resulted in about $30 million US dollars in losses per day because they were unable to process trade in and out of their country. In July, the Shanghai police had 1 billion citizens' records exposed, which is the largest known data breach to date. I'm sure somebody, we can have another incident like that fairly soon. There's going to be even more people. In July, there was 5.4 million user accounts that were exposed by Twitter. Now, the reason that one's particularly interesting, it looks relatively small change compared to some of the other numbers that you can see here. But for a lot of journalists and dissidents and political activists, they're using Twitter anonymously. The information that was actually accessed there linked people's Twitter accounts back to phone numbers. So this has real-world consequences for people being able to live their life and express their political opinions. And Twilio, another sort of small change number that you see here at the bottom here, only 125 customers have accessed. Well, the problem with this is that Twilio forms the backbone of a lot of one-time password, multi-factor authentication, SMSs that you get. So if you pop Twilio, you get to see a heap of data that's going backwards and forwards. And in this particular attack, only last month it was used to try and enroll new Signal devices to existing accounts to snoop on the communications of journalists and political activists. So, this is just the last 6 months, and this is just the lowlights that I picked out here. This is only getting more and more problematic. And as you can see here from IBM's report, the phishing is really the top of the pops here in terms of the financial impact and the frequency. Then we've also as well got stolen and compromised credentials, which is definitely more in the ballpark of what we're talking about here with APIs, and the vulnerabilities in third-party softwares. But there's a long tail, but we can see very clearly that phishing and stolen and compromised credentials are two of the most impactful ways that organisations are being breached. And APIs are really at the centre of many of these incidents as well, right? So at the end of the day, the API is just a tool to get data from one place to another. So making sure that we can make the APIs that we're building, that we're responsible for, that we have the stewardship and ownership of, as secure as possible is really important as practitioners who are responsible and on the hook for this. And so also the other thing that's happened in the last year is the OWASP Top 10. If you're in the previous session, we sort of went through that a little bit as well. So the OWASP Top 10 is updated roughly every 4 years. And there are some pretty big movers and shakers that are in here compared 2017 compared to 2021. So the first one here is broken access control. So that's based on the pure the volume of weaknesses that are being detected out there in the wild, and vulnerabilities and organisations that are surveyed and organisations that are breached. It's rocketed up from number 5 to number 1. So OWASP considers this to be the most important thing that you can invest in from a security and application security perspective over the next sort of 4 to 5 years. Cryptographic failures has bumped up from 3 to 2. So it wasn't previously called cryptographic failures. It used to be called sensitive data exposure. And part of the reason that they changed that was it was more about describing a cause rather than a symptom. So sensitive data exposure is more of a symptom of a lack of cryptography and use of cryptography. Also, injection has bumped down from number 1 to number 3. This is actually a really, really good sign because injection has basically led the OWASP Top 10 for a little bit over a decade, actually. So it shows that if it's raised in forums like this, like the OWASP Top 10, decision makers will pay attention to it. And as an industry, there will be investment in it and we get better at it. So it hasn't completely dropped out of the top 10, but just in terms of the sheer number of vulnerabilities that are being disclosed and exploits that are being run, it has dropped down quite a bit, which is really great to see. The other brand new one is insecure design, which is new on the list here, and that's rocketed up to number 4. So we're going to be talking today about the OWASP Top 10 and the cost of a data breach report from IBM and some of the architectural patterns here. And that's really the good news that I want to try and bring here. Like, I started the talk with a bit of a downer, I'm sorry about that. It's going to get a lot better from here. So there are technical solutions to a lot of these problems that we're talking about here. So there's a lot of new tech that has sort of been, that has emerged over the last decade, that has been incubated, that it's reached a critical mass, has got enough inertia and momentum behind it, that it becomes a safe bet for at least the next sort of 5 to 10 years. The other interesting thing as well is that there are old architectural techniques that are actually gaining new life as well. So things that we've previously explored, we went, it doesn't quite work because of these particular usability problems, but there are new innovations in sort of adjacent spaces that actually give new life to those previous techniques. So we're going to talk a little bit about those as well. The other really interesting thing to pay attention to here, this is from the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. It's a report that they released in February. So it's looking at the second half of 2021. And OAIC found that most attacks aren't actually on the systems itself. The attacks are actually performed against the people who have access to those systems. So we need to think much bigger, not just about the API and API security, because like system failure is only one part of it. Our systems exist in a broader ecosystem where there are people that are involved. And so making sure that we're arming our people with the right information and the right tools to be able to operate securely is really important for actually ensuring the overall security of our APIs that we are building. The other thing here as well is that it's good that you're hearing this talk and you're listening to it now, because it's a lot cheaper to invest now in a lot of these techniques than after you get breached or regulated. In fact, there's a survey that came out a couple of months ago that showed that 90% of organisations who suffer a data breach in the US go out of business within 5 years. So that's a pretty stark statistic. So if you don't want to get breached and you don't want to be regulated out of the market, time to start adopting some of these techniques. And the good news here is that a lot of this is just about doing the basics well. This is something the All Blacks mantra that they have. They say we're going to succeed and we're going to win by executing the basics well every day. So what are these architectures and techniques that we think that we could be iterating towards here that are really going to set you up for the next sort of 5 to 10 years? So the first one is third-party identity providers. And you're probably familiar with this in one form or another. So what we're talking about here is not rolling your own auth, right? We're talking about using a third-party identity provider, one of the big platforms like an Auth0, a Ping, an Okta. And part of the reason for doing that is that it's eliminating a lot of undifferentiated heavy lifting that you have to do in your organization if you're building a system that's replicating a lot of this functionality that these platforms are able to provide for you. And when we're talking about third-party identity providers, we're talking about untrusted clients and trusted servers. So what that means is that a potential client authenticates or attempts to authenticate to an identity provider. The IDP sets up a session with the API saying, yes, I've authenticated this person, this is a valid session, go and talk to the API. And the API itself gets to remain relatively ignorant of the users. It knows that an IDP is given an OK, and or not. And the nice thing about that is that it reduces the attack surface quite significantly of what you have to defend inside your APIs. And the reason that you should care about this is it's less code. So it means that there's lower ongoing maintenance costs, and it frees you up as a team to be able to focus on higher value, higher impact activities. The other thing that's really salient, which isn't necessarily obvious, is that the big players, your big providers like your Auth0s, your Pings, your Oktas, they're able to provide better threat detection than what you're actually able to build. So they've got automated systems in place that are looking at password spraying, credential stuffing, users that log in one geographic region and then somehow teleport to the other side of the planet in a matter of minutes, to access the same resource again. So, we're all smart people. It's all possible to build that sort of technology and that capability within our authentication, within our APIs, but why? Why bother? It's not, unless that's your actual business and that's the thing that you're making money, you're able to sell that capability onto other people. It's undifferentiated heavy lifting. It's not providing a lot of business value. That's cool. No worries. Okay, no worries. One moment, please. Hey, there we go. Is it coming back? This presentation is eventually consistent. No worries. I've got another adapter that I can switch to as well if it's not working.
Back up. No, it's not.
Yep, I am. How did I get halfway through my presentation before hitting that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's been free, 2 rooms have just freaked out, so for the same reason. So,
okay.
Yeah. That looks much better. Okay, cool.
I will touch nothing other than advanced slide. All right, bear with me. Right, and the other reason for doing this is that your APIs then become integrated with the broader organizational IAM controls as well. So it's not just about access to your APIs, it's about all of your productivity tools, all the business tools that you're using to actually communicate and get stuff done on a day-to-day basis. And it means that you can attribute API access and behavior back to a particular identity. So you know that, like we talked about, if you've got a user that's teleporting from one side of the planet to another, then, okay, that's maybe a reason to start throwing in additional controls there, like getting them to re-authenticate, getting them to use a different, throw in a multi-factor authentication token or something like that, as a way to re-authenticate and actually validate that this person that's appeared on the other side of the planet is actually the person that you think that it is. And the reason that this is important is that it's going to touch all of these different attack vectors that IBM talk about in their report, with compromised credentials and cloud misconfiguration in particular. And the reason that the sort of defenses that we're putting in here are for identification or ID and authentication failures. So we're talking about cred stuffing and spraying, which I talked a bit about before. Cred recovery abuse is a really interesting one as well. particularly with like Instagram is a really good example of this. They've evolved that system and the account recovery over a long enough period of time that there's all sorts of interesting sort of channels and pathways through it that allow attackers to actually take advantage of having only small amounts of different information about an account that they are attempting to compromise. And they can actually leverage that to gain access to the account. And so, you know, Instagram's sort of like the pathological worst case in that regard. But you'll probably find that if you've built account recovery things into your application, you've maybe used some off-the-shelf framework and tweaked it a little bit, there may be some interesting abuse paths that you haven't really considered before. And the nice thing about moving it all into a third-party identity provider is that it will, it's going to narrow that field there, things that you have to worry about. As well, we've got like broken access controls for like checking bypasses and switching to inverting it to deny by default rather than allow by default. And the fundamental thing here is that we've been so focused on auth that we've forgotten about auth. So we're focused on the authentication piece, but not on the authorization piece. And this really frees you up to work on the more impactful problems inside your organization. So things like RBAC and ABAC, and moving to stronger authentication methods as well, like passwordless and FIDO. So the next thing that I want to talk about is RPC and standardized serialization formats for data over the wire. So when we're talking about RPC here, we're talking about using code generation to handle routes, serialization, HTTP methods, and errors as well, error handling. And so two obvious examples of that are gRPC by Google and twerp by Twitch. So they've got different ways of constructing the payload using protobufs as a binary representation or as a JSON. They use different versions of HTTP, and maybe if you've got streaming requirements for like long-lived data ingestion and things like that, you might want to choose one over the other. But horses for courses, really. So serialization is the interesting bit though, right? Here we're talking about strongly typed communication for data that is going over the wire, particularly for network transport, but potentially as well for the longer term storage. And the reason that we want to do this is that it reduces the attack surface that you have to defend, which means that you can mitigate attacks like injection, right? So if you know that the data, the untrusted, unsanitized input that you're receiving from your user is going to have to be put down into one of these strongly typed messages, it becomes a lot easier to catch a lot of the bad data that could potentially be entered into your application at the edge before it's even left the user's browser. And so in a protocol buffers world here, we're describing like the data structure on the right-hand side here, and then we use the inbuilt tools from protobufs to compile bindings for the different languages that you want to use. And then that actually produces a very efficient binary format for encoding and decoding the data structures as well. Has backwards compatibility support as well, which is something that you often don't think about when you're switching to this, but it is really, really important as it's not just building it, it's also about maintaining the system that you're building longer term. And the reason that you want to do this is that you're only going to be providing an attack surface to what the endpoint explicitly exposes. You can also stop a lot of enumeration attacks as well. And it also helps you build secure clients faster. So generating clients for different languages, automatically generating documentation, and with the backwards compatibility baked in. Again, it affects like vulnerabilities and third-party softwares and system errors. So in terms of all the techniques that I'm talking about today, it's probably one of the lowest impact ones, but it's a neat thing that does eliminate a particular class of vulnerabilities. And again, you're going to be able to defend against injection, privilege escalation. This is an interesting one, like gaining remote code execution through object deserialization, which is something that you can do, particularly in like the authentication space as well. It's relatively straightforward to do that, particularly if you're using like weak cryptography and known public keys, for instance, to encrypt like session tokens and things like that. The other bit is like resource exhaustion. So, a denial of service attack, if you can just say, okay, this data that's coming over the wire is bad, it doesn't fit into my protocol buffer spec, I'm just going to drop and I'll log it, right? I can just move on with my life. The other thing, actually, we can talk about this later, I'm running out of time, but application level encryption, that's the next one here that's actually really, really important. So what we're talking about with application level encryption is we're talking about encrypting the data before it even hits your database. So we know that this is the best defense against data breaches. So, we've all seen databases that look like this, right? So you've got a big old users table and you've got Medicare and dates of birth and, dates of last visit. And, one of the simplest things that we can do is to encrypt that data before it even hits the database in the first place, right? So, you can see what that looks like on the bottom here. And this is a known technique. It's been around for literally decades, but the adoption of it is very, very low. Why is that? Well, we know that when we do that, the queries that we want to perform against that data are impossible. There is so much in the user experience of what we build in our applications, in our APIs, that is based on search that you lose out if you encrypt that data in the database, right? So a basic query like, show me all the records that match this particular Medicare number, or a partial match even. Like you can't do that. You can do like a full match with like deterministic encryption schemes, but you can't do partial matches and things like that. And this technique is very, very popular. Like there's a wide range of app-level encryption plugins for most of the languages and frameworks out there. You can see them here for all the major languages. But all of them have exactly the same caveat, which is that the moment that you do that, you lose the ability to be able to search. So the thing that's really changed, this new technique that's come up in the last couple of years, is searchable symmetric encryption, and that really unlocks the ability to be able to do application-level encryption. So you index the encrypted records and you search them as a separate data store. They're sort of like a look-aside pattern like you might have with like an Elasticsearch rather than pounding your database. But the neat thing about that is that the searches themselves that you're performing are actually fully encrypted. So with a proper searchable encrypted index, the queries that are sent over the wire are completely encrypted. All of the comparisons are done in the blind. So the index never actually sees any of the plain text data in the first place. And so this is an old pattern with this new applications, right? So things like what we're building at CipherStash and also MongoDB's queryable encryption. Those are both techniques that you can use for exposing this sort of data once it's been encrypted. And again, it limits all these different types of attack vectors. And again, most attacks aren't on the core systems; they're on the people who have access to it. So you can think of that level of encryption as being like multi-factor authentication almost for your data. So when you've got broken access control, security misconfigurations, or like just an incomplete threat model, you know that you can always fall back on your data being encrypted in your application. The last bit, I'm going to finish up very quickly, is security static analysis. And this is the bit that ties all of these three other bits that I've talked about together. So here we're talking about using tools that analyze our application code and our infra code for known vulnerabilities. So there's tons of well-established open source tools that can do this, like SemGrep and TFSec. You can integrate those into your continuous integration pipelines, catch insecurity before it's actually shipped to production. So if we look at, say, TFSec, you can see here this is like you run this over your Terraform code, and what it'll do is it'll find insecure defaults and configurations that you might have accidentally put in there. It's got hundreds of checks across all the major and minor clouds as well. Again, really easy to drop into your CI pipelines. You run this over like a Terraform code base that has never had any of these checks applied to it. You will be surprised at the number of things that this will show up, and just obvious glaring security holes that aren't obvious, actually. The other thing here is SemGrep. So the same thing here works on an application level as well. So it supports over 25 different languages, thousands of rules out of the box, really easy to write your own new rules, which is the interesting part that I want to talk about here. And the reason that you want to do this is that you're able to identify default accounts and features, implementation exposure, miscontrols, things like that. But the reason that we want to use these security static analysis tools is to identify and enforce secure code standards. So once you're making the switch to app-level encryption, RPC, or authorization access controls here, you can actually enforce a lot of that using the static analysis tools. So to recap, these are the techniques that should be on your radar: third-party identity providers, standardized serialization formats, application-level encryption, security static analysis. Most of the attacks aren't on the core systems, they're on the people. Cheaper to invest now than after you get breached or regulated out of business. And you're going to succeed just by doing the basics well. Thank you very much. Jeff, under questions?
Mate.
You can say no.
Yeah, we don't.
Yep, cool. We've got to get the next talk going. So if you're interested in asking me questions, feel free to find me in the hallway after this session. Thank you.